Hello all, I am Weeformer. I love to make cute things and I want to share my plush sewing tips, tricks, and to also share my process with you. So today I'm going to be making a plush Blurr and I'm going to show you how I do it. The first thing I do is research. For every character that I've never made before, I look up the images from comics, if that's the style I'm going for, which is what I'm doing for this Blurr. And create new pattern pieces. Next up is the embroidery process. I've already made the files in a program called Embroidery. I'm going to show the actual stitching out on the machine. So the first thing I do is grab my fabrics. Here I'm finding which direction the pile is going nap-wise, making sure that it points downward, and then load my hoop up. I use a tearaway stabilizer on the back, and then I use this plastic, it's supposed to be water-soluble interfacing on the front to help keep all the fibers of that higher pile fabric nice and flat for when the needle is going over it. Once I have my hoop loaded, I very carefully pin down that piece of water-soluble on the top. I don't like to hoop it with the rest of the fabric and interfacing. It tends to just be too much inside the hoop, and this way I can make sure it's nice and taut across the surface of the other two pieces. Next, I load up the sewing machine, the embroidery machine. I have my pattern loaded in the screen to the right there, and here I am struggling to thread the needle with my camera in the way. But after I get it all threaded, put the foot down, and I'm going to show you how I do those applique eyes. I do not stitch down or use any sticky adhesive for the little pieces of fabric I use for the applique. I actually just throw the scrap on. I sort of cut a piece that I know will be enough size-wise. And as you can see, I've reused that scrap. And then the machine from the pattern that I already set up in the embroidery file, I have it do something called a stay stitch. And that's what it's doing right now. So it's holding down the fabric right where the satin stitch will go back over after I've trimmed it. But I'm very carefully, and if you do this, watch your fingers, be super careful, and just guide the fabric so it doesn't get crunched under the foot while I'm doing this. Next up is the tedious part, which is cutting away all this extra fabric. I was having a hard time getting it into the camera, like a good angle, so I apologize, but I have a pair of curved embroidery scissors here. They are specifically meant for tasks just like this. Don't ever take the fabric out of the hoop. It's lined up to the embroidery file that was already created, so you just want to very carefully trim off this extra fabric, and that raw edge will be caught in what's called satin stitch by the next phase of the embroidery file. Here it is sped up, so I wish it was this fast in real life. That would make it so much easier. But yeah, so doing both sets of eyes. That's the other thing, is I try and set up my embroidery files to be as efficient as possible. So I try and get two faces and a hoop if I can. I did not record the part where it was doing the satin stitch, so I do apologize, but you can see it here. It did the satin stitch, it held down that edge of that fabric, and then put their little, I guess, pupils, the expressive parts of their eyes in the middle, which is just a fill stitch, usually. And now you can see a close-up in real time of his little mouth being stitched out. I used a blue fabric. I kind of went blue on blue on blue for him because, you know, he is Blurr. And the little face I gave him was kind of, you know, a little smirky, a little smug. You can see just how fast the machine actually is. It's also very loud. You do not have to listen to it in this video. I muted it. Alright, next up I'm going to do all of the finishing work on the plush. I've already sewn everything on the sewing machine, And now I'm going to gather all my supplies up to get him all done. So first thing you need is thread. I use a pair of scissors dedicated to thread. I call them my thread scissors. I use a pair of hemostats for stuffing and turning. I'll show that in another video. And here are my needles in my little hedgehog needle holder that I made. And bean bags. This is what helps them stand. I put them in their feet, and I usually put them in bags. It's just easier to put into the plush this way, and it's also safer. And now I have all the added pieces, which is his head crest, the side pieces for his head, the top of his head, which is like a little speedy piece, and his little chest. And now the final thing you need for finishing the plush is the main body, unstuffed, nice and flat, very silly looking. I will show how I stuff in another video, but I thought I'd do some little cut magic here. And voila, he is stuffed. The bean bags are in the feet, stuffing in the body. And I'm going to go through and just show me attaching all these pieces onto him to give him his final look. I start with the head crest, and in a minute you'll see that I forgot to do something else first. But here I go. I'm going to close up that hole that I used for turning the piece inside out. I like to hide it on the back side, and once I stitch it to the head, it becomes completely invisible. I use what's called a ladder stitch, which you use to attach things, to close things. Especially on this type of fabric, it holds really nicely. And here's the part that I forgot. I forgot to close the back of the head first. You should do that first. For some reason, I always get overexcited and I start just attaching pieces, and I'm like, oh, I forgot to close the head, which I did here. All right, back to that front crest. Go ahead and reload my needle. I do this so many times while I am attaching pieces. I'm constantly redoing the needle, but here we go. I attached it pretty securely around the nose and up the forehead. I don't stitch the whole thing down. It takes a lot of time and it's not really necessary. So after securing the center, I go ahead and place it sort of where I want it to go there, like kind of eyeball it, and then I use a tacking stitch to attach it to the head, and I go over it as, I wouldn't say do tightly because you can put too much strain on a thread, but as thoroughly, I guess, as possible. I usually go over the same area a few times in that corner to make sure. You can see me tugging on it to make sure it's nice and secure. And once it is, I go ahead and I pull a knot down to the base, and then I usually pull it through a few times just to extra secure it, and then pull it through the head and trim. So after I've done that to the other side, I'm going to go ahead and put on his little side pieces. I do stitch a little bit more around on these, not as much though, because I want the little wings to come off of his head. I have not put any stiffener into this particular piece, partly because it doesn't really need it. The fabric itself with the multiple layers and all the embroidery that's on it is pretty stiff already. So I just leave it as is. Sometimes I will put a stiffener inside if I feel like the shape is not holding, just like the crest has a stiffener inside. I just use a super thick interfacing that I get at, Joann Fabrics. You can order online. It's not anything fancy. All right, now that he's got his side pieces on, time to finish the last two pieces. I'm gonna put that speedy head crest on and his little chest. Now he's got his little chest on, and I use the same ladder stitch. It's not any mystery. And then his little head crest. There he goes. And he's done. I try and do as minimal of pieces as I can for the final so that I'm not spending hours stitching on pieces. And there he is, all finished up. As you can see, he looks very different in 3 dimensions. I'm excited to share him in a video so you can see him turning here from all angles. You can see how pretty the embroidery thread looks. You can see that as I said, I make 2 usually at a time. It's just more efficient with my hoop. And I appreciate you watching this video. I hope you have learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.